We'll do a second take now on this. Joining us again is the lawyer and former chairman of the National Human Rights Commission, Professor Chidi Odinkalu. Professor Odinkalu, I hope you can hear me now. Good to see you and thanks for your time. Apologies earlier on. So quickly here, we're looking at, Professor Odinkalu, if you can hear me, we're looking at the situation in Gabon and Niger. You were an advisor to the AU and looking at the leaders across the continent and narrow it down to Gabon and Niger. What do you think is wrong to the extent that we've seen a contagion of coups in some of these countries?
No, thanks a lot for having me. I'm a little careful about the widespread notion of a contagion theory or thesis in this circumstance. I think every country is unique. Anyone who knows Gabon will know that there was no democracy in Gabon. And so the idea that somehow what's happened in Gabon overthrew a democracy is nonsensical, in my view. Secondly, what's happened in Gabon is quite substantially different from what's happening in, or what's happened in the French West African territories, from Guinea to Niger, indeed even as far as Chad, where you have what appears to be a break or an attempt at a break with the legacies of French colonialism. By contrast, in Gabon, what appears to have happened is essentially a consolidation of French interests with the interim military leader, the transitional military leader who's recently got promoted a brigadier general, was director general in the presidency and a cousin of the president. And I don't know whether you've noticed that today he's issued a decree reinstating the Constitutional Court. And there is every possibility that the Constitutional Court could come back and ratify the idea that President Bongo was re-elected and he could return to power. That's potentially quite possible. And I think we've got to take our time before reaching conclusions on what's happened in Gabon.
Well, while we take our time, and we need to also go back to how you started off, that there's no democracy in Gabon, even as we've seen that election. Take us through some of the complaints that we've seen in some of these countries, because in Niger, it was about bad governance, and in Gabon, it's about the election, and some have said that's just a smokescreen.
I don't know whether you followed the elections that took place in Gabon in 2016, in August 2016. President Bongo's dad ruled from December 1967 until he died on the 8th of June, I believe, 2009. And the son took over, did the first 7 years, and went up for election in 2016 against his brother-in-law, Jean-Ping, who used to be the chairperson of the Commission of the African Union. And in that election, President Bongo lost in 6 of the 9 provinces of Gabon. He won by 5,594 votes. Pretty much all of that came from one region, Otogwe. In Otogwe is also where the Bongos come from. They come from Otogwe. And in Otogwe, the turnout in that election, in that particular province, was 99%. Of that 99%, 95.46% of the votes were allocated to Ali Bongo. Now, when they announced the results, when the Electoral Commission announced the results on the 31st, I believe, of August 2016, there was massive unrest. Lots of people were killed. The National Assembly, in fact, was burned. The African Union got involved in trying to de-escalate the violence, and the heads of state who had worked with Jean-Ping persuaded him to go to the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court was headed by a mistress of President Ali Bongo's dad, who had died. They ruled at midnight on the 23rd of September 2016 2016 saying that Bongo had in fact won. What kind of court sits at midnight to deliver a judgment? There was nobody in the court. But this basically is bringing the idea of democracy into disrepute. Now, you go from country to country, this is what you're seeing. In Mali, for instance, the ruling party was not just happy to win elections. They also went to use the constitutional court to deprive the opposition of their own seats. That was what led to the popular uprising in Mali. In Guinea, Alpha Conde, who had been an opposition politician, used incumbency to overthrow the constitution that brought him to power and give himself a life presidency, giving the people no option. And as a result, the military overthrew him and the people supported the military. In Niger, you have a slightly unique situation in which a mix of violence, as in Islamist violence, and nation-building issues, including ethnicity issues, have got involved in persuading, in constituting themselves into the reasons why the military have struck. But I think every country presents a unique narrative that should preclude this idea of a coup contagion.
And Professor Odinkalu, then it then means that the pseudo-democracy, let's use that word now, is a little bit understood in some of these countries. I mean, look at Rwanda and look at Cameroon. For instance, Rwanda, you saw how Paul Kagame came to power in 2000, even after becoming a rebel guerrilla war fighter, and he's tweaked the constitution. Now, looking at the constitution, which they always would want to tweak, does that also make it legal once it's already in the constitution that gives you some kind of tenure elongation, for instance, what we're seeing so far in Rwanda?
No, but really, part of the crisis of elective governance in Africa is the crisis of interminable presidencies. Because people are finding that they have no option for turning over governments whose contingent legitimacy has expired. I say contingent legitimacy because the legitimacy you get from elections is time-specific, and it needs to be continually renewed. But when governments make it impossible for people to exercise that option to renew that legitimacy properly, then choice, which democratic choice, becomes strangulated. And that's really what you have in many of these countries. Paul Biya did not campaign in the last election in Cameroon. He was announced a winner. And anyone who looked at Paul Biya at his last appearance in the United States will feel sorry for him, because nobody should be exposed to the kinds of indignities that he subjected himself to as an old man. We are in an African continent in which we should have respect for our elders. But those indignities are self-inflicted because of the kind of cult that has been created around him. And I do think this is the problem here, that in many of these countries, increasingly, democratic choice is precluded. And therefore, the governments have not really performed to the level to justify any fidelity with the people. And therefore, it is easy to remove them with public support because people are frustrated. That really is the problem. Now, why am I saying all of this? And what's really the point of this? We are focusing too much on military coups and not on unconstitutional change in government. And unconstitutional change in government is more than just military coups. Obviously, a military coup is an unconstitutional change in government. But civilian coups are also happening in many places. What happened in Zimbabwe last week was a civilian coup. What Alpha Conde did in Guinea-Conakry was a civilian coup. What Ali Bongo did, closing the borders, shutting down the internet, and excluding everybody from observing the elections, was a civilian coup. We should treat civilian coups with just the same degree of vehemence that we treat military coups. That way, we know that we are fighting the same virus. Now, what's the difference? A civilian coup abducts an entire country. A military coup abducts the one person who is capable of abducting the entire country. Both are abductions.
And it comes back to the AU. If these are civilian coups, and we've always seen the leaders of AU only speak against military coups, this so-called peer review mechanism, speaking amongst themselves, hasn't actually helped. I mean, look at Gabon. Less than 3 million in population, and with the amount of crude it produces daily, is still a poor country.
Gabon, for its population, is actually quite a wealthy country. You just need to go to the country to find out. Libreville is one of the most expensive cities in the world, and Gabon is in the heart of the Congo Basin, and nature has its headquarters in Gabon. It's a wealthy country. No Gabonese should have to worry about where the next meal is going to come from. But the Bongos have turned one of the most beautiful, one of the most blessed countries on earth into their private estate and strangulated the entire place. In my view, in cahoots with France. France has been there all along. The first coup in Gabon took place on the 17th of August, 1964, against the independence president, Léon Mba. And it lasted for 3 days. And on the third day, the French reinstated President Mba. Of course, they discovered shortly thereafter that he was suffering from terminal cancer. And that was when they started casting about for who would replace him. And they settled on Omar Bongo, who became vice president in November 1966 at the age of 30. Now, and the rest, as they say, is history, because when President Mba died the following year in 1967, Omar Bongo became president, and he ruled until 2009. Now, and France has never really gone away. They've got military installations all over the place. They've got military installations in Chad. They've got in Niger. They've got all over their territories in Africa. And that is part of what the populations are angry about, that a colonial power is dominating their locations and their countries and strangulating them from enjoying the beauty and the wealth that their lands have got to offer. Now, I'm not saying this because I support military coups, because I don't. I don't think soldiers have the solutions to the problems that we confront. But the civilians are also not doing the things they are supposed to do. And we've got to call both sides out. That's really my point.
Is it safe to say what we have witnessed so far in some of these countries is a kind of revolution against former colonial masters, in this case, France?
Well, as you would probably notice, with the exception of Zimbabwe and Sudan, all the coups in Africa since 2017, and there have been about 11 of them, and about 22 attempted coups since 2013, all of the territories, apart from these two, have been French-speaking territories. And you've got to ask yourself, why is that so? And I think people have got to take notice that the contagion, to the extent that anything of the sort exists, is afflicting mostly French-speaking territories. Having said that, as I said, Gabon is actually in a different league. Gabon, it appears to me to be a situation of finding a way to consolidate French interests rather than to fight against French interests. What is happening in French-speaking West Africa, therefore, is different from what has happened in Gabon. I think we've got to be very clear about that. Again, the other thing is that you've got to say there's also been French overreach, because France deployed Operation Barkhane, or Operation Barkhane, in Mali to try to respond to what was supposed to be Islamist violence. But in reality, people saw it as an extension of imperial French designs on one of their former territories. So rather than help, actually, the French deployment of Barkhane into Mali hindered and then created a contagion of revulsion against French overreach, or perceptions of French overreach. And I do think that's a major factor in what is happening in the French Sahelian territories. And that's why this is different from what is happening in Gabon.
end with this. Can AU help resolve these crises?
No. I think the AU has lost authority and quite honestly lost relevance. And the fact that it could not help its former chairperson, Jean-Ping in Gabon, to maintain equality of arms in the elections in 2016 in Gabon just advertises the extent of the AU's irrelevance. But part of the reason why bodies like AU and ECOWAS are struggling with relevance in these situations is precisely what I've talked about. The fact that they have mollycoddled civilian coups and are condemning only military coups. When elections are manifestly and rampantly rigged and brought into disrepute, the AU and the ECOWAS go on out to endorse them. When Alpha Conde killed a lot of Guineans in order to make himself life president in Guinea, Conakry, in 2020, the under cover of COVID, by the way, the ECOWAS and the AU said nothing to condemn him. They recognized his regime. I could even go further back. In 2013, when General Sisi took over in Egypt and eliminated President Morsi, who was himself democratically elected, and credibly so, the rules of the AU under the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance actually said that those who plotted coups could not use the opportunity of incumbency from a coup to legalize themselves in office. General Sisi went on to organize an election in which was only credible candidate. He got nearly 95% of the, he allocated himself about 95% of the votes in that election. And the AU didn't just recognize him, they went on to make him the chairperson of the Assembly of Heads of State and Government of the AU. People are looking at all of this. And I could add Chad, where the son of President Deby, a general himself, took over power at the killing of his father in 2021. And the chairperson of the African Union, Musa Faki Mahamat, who used to be General Deby's foreign minister, created an exception for Chad, for the son of his benefactor, from the AU's rules governing unconstitutional changes in government, making what happened in Chad legitimate and lawful. The AU, as a result of these double standards and hypocrisies, has absolutely lost credibility on the question and lacks the authority to do anything about this, sadly.
Thank you for your time, Professor Chidi Odinkalu.